Let us talk, you and I, about big ideas. I mean, we're kind of basing this course around the idea of ideas and why ideas are important and what ideas help us in our society, what ideas help us construct the society that we want. So let's talk about ideas. And this week, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about even more abstract ideas than democracy. With democracy, because we live in a society where we vote and we feel like we've got a sense of democracy, we feel like we are a democracy, we exist in a democracy. With democracy, we have a basic understanding of what democracy is. When it comes to justice, which is what we're starting on this week, what we're starting to think about, justice is one of those things that's really hard to nail down. And sometimes it's even hard to nail down what exactly you're talking about. You can talk about justice like you talk about as a part of the legal system. What is legal? What is illegal? What is just? What is unjust? Justice is the law coming down upon you or deciding in your favor. So we can talk about justice as legality. You can also talk about justice as morality. Are you making a just decision? Were you treated justly? And is there a right or wrong? And if you are acting in a wrong way, are you being unjust? The way that we're talking about justice for this class is as an idea, as a philosophical idea that we need to figure out. And it's a grand philosophical idea. It's an idea that people have been trying to figure out for centuries, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, and even before that. Because justice is one of those things that we have a sense that there's this thing called justice, but we're not quite sure what it means or what it is about the human experience that makes something just or unjust. So we have thinkers like Aristotle and Kant and Rousseau and Hume, John Rawls, Amartya Sen, who come along and say, I've got an idea. Here's what justice is. I'm asking you to think about it because I think it's an interesting thought exercise to really try to figure out what justice is. And it's also a good academic exercise to take this huge abstract concept and try to wrap your hands around it, try to fit it into your brain, try to figure out what the conventions of the conversation are. Let's pause for a minute, though, and think about why do people have questions about justice? And I'm going to try not to go too far into a philosophical discussion here because this is not a philosophy class, it's a writing class. And we're talking about writing. You'll see when you look at the writing assignment, writing number 3, how this fits into the writing class. So I do think we do need a little bit of introduction on why do people talk about justice. If you watch the Michael Sandel lecture, Michael Sandel is a professor at Harvard. He's a professor of ethics and philosophy. He's written a book called Justice. If you watch that lecture, you'll see a couple things. One, you'll get to see a Harvard lecture room with Harvard students and a really famous professor talking to a group of 1,000 people or 500 people. I'm not sure how many people were there. But you'll also see a pretty knowledgeable guy lay out why the study of justice is such an important thing. And the way he starts is with a really traditional kind of idea. It's been around for 40, 50 years, which is the trolley problem. Here's the trolley problem. You're standing by a railroad. There's a trolley coming down the railroad. You're standing by the switch. The trolley is going to, if it keeps on going in the way that it's going, is going to run smack dab into 5 people who have been tied to the railroad tracks. It's going to kill them all. You could flip the switch. And if you flip the switch, the trolley is going to veer off from that one track and go into the next track where it's just going to kill one person. So, what do you do? What that problem is a problem of ethics, and it asks you, what are your ethics, and on what basis do you make your decision? Do you decide to let the trolley just kill the 5 people? Do you take an action in the world and decide to kill one person. Either way, many ethicists would say that you're culpable for what happens next. Just by being there, you have to make a decision. Most likely, and Sandel points this out in his lecture, you would decide, well, the needs of the few are less important than the needs of the many. And so it makes sense to flip the switch and let the trolley kill the one person. Let the trolley avoid the 5 people. We can complicate the matter. What happens if the 5 people that the trolley might kill are all, let's say, corporate CEOs, and the one person that the trolley might kill is an HFC student? Or what happens if the 5 people that the trolley might kill are all old men, 90 years old? They've lived a long life. And the one person the trolley might kill is a baby, barely had a life. What happens if the 5 people are all priests and the one person is Taylor Swift? On what conditions do you base your decisions? How do you know what is just? John Rawls has some suggestions for what is just. And his suggestion is that you can base the question of justice on a theory of justice, and that the theory of justice is based on a social contract, that we as a society decide what should be just. And what Rawls tries to do is set up a framework for that decision. How do you engage in discourse with each other in order to make a just decision? He says there has to be an original position. And that original position is a blindness to your own conditions as compared to others. You do not see yourself as being any greater than others' positions, and nobody else is greater than your position. You are all equal. Rawls's idea there is, if we can come into a discussion about justice, we can reach fairness if we don't privilege our own positions. And then he says, once we come into a discussion of justice, we also have to recognize those who the decisions we make will affect. We'll have to decide who's the people that will be most affected by our decision, either to the good or the bad. The people who need to be most affected to the good, or the people who don't really need much help to be affected to the good. We have to consider those, and what Rawls says is that a justice as fairness means that everybody is raised a little by any decision we make. If we make a decision about voting, everybody should have their rights enhanced. If we make a decision about taxes, everybody should have their rights enhanced. It doesn't mean that every decision brings everybody equal in justice, but that no decision should do this, where we have one group that gets more enhanced and the other group which loses some rights. That's John Rawls. John Rawls wrote a huge book called Justice as Fairness, and then a book, Justice, Political Theory. John Rawls is perhaps the most important philosopher of the United States has brought into the world. He has affected, ever since Rawls first wrote his first books, he has affected the entire world with his beliefs about justice. And the reason why is because he brought to light an idea that hadn't been articulated before. The truth of the matter is, you and I will walk down the street, go to the mall, come to campus. We will do things, and we will do them on the basis of what we believe is just, ordinarily. Or if we don't do them on the basis of what we believe is just, we make a decision not to focus on justice and focus on something else. But we never really articulate our reasons for those beliefs. Often, our reasons are religious, or that's the way my parents taught me, or I believe that all people are equal. We don't really articulate why what we believe is just. And what Rawls was trying to do was to develop an articulation. In doing that, he was following in a tradition of many other writers and thinkers, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, who wrote about utilitarianism, the belief that the greatest good for the greatest many is what is just. Or Moses from from Judeo-Hebraic Islamic tradition, um, where who came up with a law and said the law is what is just because God said that's what should be just. There are many, many ways we can talk about justice, and there have been many, many theorists who talked about justice. Another one is Amartya Sen. You read a short passage from Sen. And Sen says that John Rawls is a smart guy. Sen bases a lot of his writing on John Rawls. But what he says about Rawls is just kind of in a fantasy land. He's just thinking out there in broad strokes about the ideal world, but the real world doesn't function like that. The real world doesn't have an original position, a way to blind yourself to your own good. And so what Sen comes up with is an idea that what we have to do is assess our justice. We have to look at context and situations and decide whether or not something that happened was just. And then from that, try to move forward into a more just world. So let's take an example of something that's happened recently in the news and think about how the two thinkers, Sen and Rawls, would think about it. Just recently, the governor of Florida said that he was not going to extend registration for voting because the deadline was this past weekend. If the deadline would stand, he wasn't going to extend it, even though a hurricane was coming to Florida. So if you hadn't registered up until that point, too bad. You could go through the hurricane and try to get registered. There was a great outcry from this. The governor of Florida is a Republican. Many Democrats cried out and said he's just trying to keep people from voting because the fewer people that vote, the more likely a Republican will win the election. It actually went to the Supreme Court, and there was a decision laid down that yes, Florida must extend its voting deadline. But let's look at it as a question of justice. What is just? And for Rawls, what would be just is the decision that would allow the most people who have the least amount of voice to vote, whatever that decision is. The people who have the least amount of voice, they are the ones who we need to make a decision in favor of, because we got to all be able to rise together. For Sen would look at the decision and say, okay, this is what happened. The governor said we weren't going to extend the deadline. Is that a just situation? Is there actually justice in that decision? Or was it an unjust decision? Who is harmed by this? Whose capabilities to be full citizens is harmed? And Sen would look at the situation and say, was this just or was this unjust? So essentially, here's what happens. For Rawls, decisions on justice are made before things happen. You set up the conditions of justice. You set up the conditions of decisions. For Sen, decisions on justice are made after things happen. You have to figure out what you believe. If you're still with me, great. I understand this is deep stuff, and it may not make a whole lot of sense on why we talk about it. But it is an important idea. How do you know what is just? How can you make a decision about justice? So let's talk now about why we're talking about all this. You've got a paper assignment that I just posted this week called Public Writing About Hard Ideas. And this paper assignment is going to ask you to talk about justice. So let's look at the paper assignment. I've got my copy here. Maybe you have your copy available. And here's the assignment. I'm going to skip over a little bit of it. As we've seen thus far in this class, the concepts of democracy and justice and rights are kind of complex, and they're much deeper and more complex and more difficult than most people ever conceive. The reason most people never conceive of the difficulty of these concepts is because we generally use the concepts as words that describe our conditions of living. We live in a democracy. I have a right to use my cell phone in class. Justice for Mike Brown, rather than as philosophical ideas about the conditions of living. So for these weeks coming up, we're going to consider philosophical ideas about the concept of justice. To help us think about those ideas as writers, I want you to think about how you would translate the complex and difficult ideas of one writer for an audience who might not normally consider those ideas. To do this, you will need to find one writer who presents an argument that defines justice, like John Rawls or Martha Nussbaum or Amartya Sen or Jacques Rousseau. There are many others, and we'll guide you to some other possibilities as we go. After you decide the writer, you got to figure out an audience whom you'd like to inform about that writer's ideas. You will need to read that writer's ideas pretty thoroughly, becoming an expert on the topic about which you will write. You will also need to You'll also need to know your audience pretty thoroughly, becoming an expert on the group to whom you will write. Then you will need to make genre decisions. What genre would best allow you to communicate the writer's ideas? What forms of writing are you comfortable with? What do you want your audience to know about those ideas? Once you figure out what you want to say, who you want to say it to, and how you want to say it, then, and only then, are you ready to begin developing the text. So let's take all that and put it into more clear language, or at least more direct language. Here's the assignment. You've got a really hard text, something that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people wouldn't be able to pick up and read. You've got this hard philosophical text. And what you're going to be asked to do is to take that text and make it meaningful for people who might not understand it. You're going to translate it. You're going to put it into simpler form. You're going to put it into a form that other people could read and appreciate and see the value of the text. Now, how are you going to do that if you don't understand the text yourself? Well, part of being a college student is being exposed to things that you don't understand, to learn about things that you don't know. So here, this assignment is asking you to be a college student, to find a text that you may not understand right now, but to read over it, work over it to the point where you do understand it, and then recreate it for an audience. You got to pick your audience. You got to know who you're going to be writing to, but then you recreate the text. That may not sound like the most interesting assignment. That may not sound like something that you would engage in on a Saturday night if you had the choice of doing that or going to a concert, going to a party. Okay, so it's a writing assignment. But there is something interesting here, and this is that as a writer, you have a choice to make. You have choices to make. You can choose the original source text. You can choose the audience to whom you're going to write. And maybe most interestingly, you can choose the genre in which you write. That leaves this pretty wide open. You could write a long poem giving John Rawls' theory. You could write a comic book giving Amartya Sen's theory. You could write a ongoing blog with multiple blog entries talking about bell Hooks's theory. There are many, many possibilities here for what you could write, and I give you some on the assignment sheet. The interesting thing about the assignment is, how are you going to take this hard text and make it meaningful for somebody who may not understand it? And who is it that you're going to make it meaningful for? So there are other elements here that you've got to consider. You must clearly, accurately, and thoughtfully cover a theorist's ideas about justice for a specific audience. Your text must show that you have read about, considered, and understood those ideas. You must identify the audience, either in the text itself or an explanatory note about the text, and your text must be effectively written for that audience. So let me explain this for a second. If you write a comic book or some comic panels, it may not be directly clear who your intended audience is. So you would want to say, well, I'm writing for hipster 20-year-olds with goatees, so that we can know who you're writing for, and that you would just add that onto your text, maybe as a postscript or maybe as a separate paper. Number 3, you must use a specific genre of writing and pay attention to the conventions of that drama. Pay attention to the conventions of that genre. The genre you choose must be sophisticated enough to allow you to cover the main ideas of your source text. For example, the genre of a text message isn't going to work. You're not going to be able to cover John Rawls through text messages. I mean, I suppose you could, but you're going to use up all your data. So you can't use text messages. That's not going to be an adequate genre. The genre of comics would work. In fact, you can go to a comic book store and see all kinds of classic texts that have been put into comic book form. And it might be a really fascinating thing if you've got any interest in comics to take John Rawls and put them into comic book form. You must also use adequate citation. The citation should include both the original author's work and any supplemental material you use to understand that author's work. If the citation would not work well within your chosen genre, then you must include a separate works cited page. And your text must be developed, constructed, written, and presented at a level appropriate for English 132. This isn't an easy assignment, but it's an interesting assignment, and I hope you get something out of it. We're going to talk about it as we talk about the readings, as we talk about more writing concepts. We're going to talk about it in the coming weeks. So keep on working on it, keep on thinking about it. Right off the bat, figure out what you want to write about. I want to mention a couple other things. I hope you're still with me. And I said that earlier in the talk because it's been pretty interesting to look at the amount of views the lectures have gotten over the weeks. We started with 66 views. We dropped to 52 views. We then went to 44 views and then to 28 views. Last week, I think we had 16 views. So I'm guessing about 8 of you are actually watching this lecture. Let's try an experiment. If you're watching the lecture, if you're still watching the lecture, send me an email. Tell me, hey Mike, I saw your lecture and this is what I got out of it, or this is what I didn't get out of it. Tell me a problem you had with what I said, or tell me what you appreciated about the lecture. Send me an email, and you should send that email to me by, let's say, Sunday night at 11:59. And if you send that email to me, I will give you 2 free quiz grades. I'll go in and manually change some of your scores so that you get 2 full quiz grades. Or I'll just tack them on at the end. You got to send me that email by 11:59 Sunday night. So I forget what the date that is. Is that the 16th? There's one thing I wanted to mention. The other things I wanted to mention was we're still doing workshop 2. I want you to do a really good job on that workshop, really comment on people's papers, give them a lot of feedback, and maybe there's a John Rawlsian connection here. If we are all at an original position, then the comments that you make about somebody else's paper assumes nothing about that person and assumes nothing about you. It's just you as a reader commenting on somebody else's paper. And you're doing that because you know that other person has the same original position. They're going to comment on your paper with no assumptions. Comment on each other's papers, do a good job on the workshop so that we can get into some good revision of writing number 2. You also have a writing exam this week. The questions will be posted tomorrow, and I'll give you a little bit of information about those questions before you get into the exam tomorrow. I think the only other thing to mention is that, there's also a video on how to take a writing exam. You should watch that video, especially if you didn't do so well on the first writing exam. The only other thing to mention is writing number 1. The grades for writing number 1 are going to be coming back in the next week. Unlike the in-class exams where I just wrote a few sentences for you, I work over your papers pretty closely, so it takes a little bit longer to get those back to you. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Sorry this video was a little bit longer, but we had to talk about deep ideas. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you're having a good week. We'll talk to you soon.